All right, before we get started with the second half of this lecture, lecture video, definitely make sure to go back and make sure that you understand the difference between the types of data that get mapped, looking at the classified and unclassified map types, because you have to have an understanding of those things in order for us to talk about the issues and problems that arise when it comes to mapping those items. When discussing the modifiable area unit problem, we have to take into account that data is often measured over larger areas. When the data becomes aggregated or combined, it may impact how we view that data. When the measurements and aggregation units are arbitrary shapes, meaning that there's no standardized size or shape for the polygon that is being represented on the map, the size and shape of those units will definitely influence how the recorded values, are portrayed on a map. In general, units with larger areas or units that have higher values tend to show up and be more distinct on maps, which can definitely skew how we view our data. The example that your book provides uses farms in states, which is affected by the size of the state. So for example, a farm or the number of farms in Texas or the number of farms in California may seem larger than the number of farms in Maine. And that's simply due to there being more area, meaning that there's a larger number of farms that could exist because the area of those states are larger than the size of Maine. And so an issue arises when we have large states or counties that have a ton of data that will show that there is, more farms or more vacant houses that affect a certain state. So not only having a larger area, having more data values that can skew like the overall percentage of what these maps might be displaying, just the simple fact that there are larger polygons, right? The states themselves are larger, they incorporate more space, meaning that there is on average a higher number of data points just because more area is covered. Again, when we are comparing states like California and Texas versus smaller states like Maine. California and Texas will, on average, just have more data points due to the size of their population, due to the size of their polygon, and therefore the maps will reflect the influence of the size of these polygons and the amount of data rather than actually showing normalized data. And so both of these issues are examples of a phenomenon that we refer to as modifiable area unit problem, or MAUP for short. And this occurs when measurements are being aggregated over arbitrarily defined areas. Analyzing spatial and statistical patterns becomes more difficult because the patterns are obscured by the aggregation scheme, meaning that how they're divided does not necessarily accurately reflect what the data is actually showing us. So we have a few methods that we can use to try and reduce the effects of the modifiable area unit problem. One way to minimize this issue is to normalize, aka dividing the data, by a suitable field which allows the data or specific data patterns to emerge. So by normalizing the data, we can divide each value by a specified variable, meaning that everything should be more equal and more easy to compare. So normalizing data allows us to look at things on a more even playing field. So instead of looking at the number of farms that exist in a polygon, a state, California versus Texas versus Maine, we can calculate the farms that exist per square mile instead. The same can be done using the examples from the book as well, looking at a fraction of the housing units rather than the total number of vacant housing that exists. And you can see the difference in the maps provided here below, right? The first maps here is just the total number of farms or the total number of vacancies that exist. And after we normalize that data, right, to try and give it a more even playing field, looking at farms per square mile or the fraction of housing, you can see how much the data has shifted. Ultimately, the numbers are the same, it's just how we are displaying this data that is changing the story. So as you can see again, there is a clear distinction between these two different data patterns. In addition to that, you can also normalize data by field percentage, where you go ahead and divide each value by the total of the values, which is another way, again, to normalize data. There are different ways that we can map this data and reducing the visual area unit problem. So using density of farms portrayed using graduated symbols instead of graduated colors, meaning instead of using these graduated colors, we can use different symbols to represent it on a state-by-state basis, right? So we can see that the eastern half of the United States has a much higher density of farms when you compare it to the west. So you can look at these different maps which are showing the same data, but obviously visually they are telling a mildly different story. So the number of farms portrayed with the dot density map is the same thing. It still looks clear that the eastern half of the country has more farms, it is more dense with farms than the west. So keep in mind how data has been normalized, what the maps are showing, and the different types of visual representations, the different types of symbols that can be used to show this data, as each type, whether it is a graduated symbol or a dot density map or a graduated symbol using colors, will show and explain data differently, and each one has its unique strengths as well as weaknesses. All right, moving on to some more information about rasters, specifically talking about thematic rasters. A thematic raster represents features or quantities such as roads, geology, elevation, or vegetation density. And the raster model is designed to store continuous values that may occur anywhere on Earth's surface, such as elevation. And if we remember talking about that before, the data generally when we're talking about rasters is going to be continuous, meaning that there is data that exists everywhere, including elevation and temperature. If you remember, generally when we talk about discrete data, that means that there is pinpoint accuracy, something that can be measured. Most of the time when we're going to be talking about the difference between continuous and discrete data is going to be linked more closely to vector data, but that does not mean that it is impossible to show raster data as being discrete. Again, discrete rasters can represent categorical or ordinal data that is displayed using a unique value map. So you can still have an image, a raster image of a road or a raster image of a lake, and you can assign certain categorical data to that discrete data type. And when talking about rasters, do not forget that we are talking about pixels or cells, so it is possible to assign unique values or classified values, stretched display methods for each image. So each cell can have a certain amount of color schemes assigned to it. And so what we can see from the bottom here is that A is going to be a unique value, B is a classified elevation, so it's a classified interval, and C is stretched. So the color scheme for unique value maps have 32 possible values and work best with data that have relatively few categories. And that's why it looks like the amount of data represented here is less detailed than the other two. The classified or stretched display methods basically divide the color values into a smaller number of bins, which then allows them to assign a color ramp to each of those chosen bins. Ultimately, it allows for more colors to be displayed depending on the data that is represented in each of the raster cells or those raster pixels, which allows us to get a much more detailed image. But let's take a closer look at the stretched image. As you can tell, there is even more detail represented on this map when looking at B, which represents the classified raster image. Ultimately, a stretched image can improve the display of the normally distributed values by ignoring the quote-unquote tails of the distribution. essentially, it relocates a smaller portion of the raster values to the 256 shades of the color scheme. In essence, the tails are way down here. So what it's going to do is cut these tails off where there's not going to be a major variation in the color that is represented in that image, and take the image here, spread it across a larger color ramp, and ultimately this is going to improve brightness and contrast. There are many different types or ways to do this, but you can see that B is the same aerial image before stretching, and C is this image after stretching where the tails have been cut off and the values or the shades have been expanded, allowing for greater detail. As you know, raster images are satellite or aerial photography, so that data is broken down into cells or pixels, and each of those cells or pixels generally represents brightness. What you may not be aware of is that you can have multiple bands, a single band or a composite band with multi-band rasters displayed. And so simply put, you can have an image and each cell will only be binary, meaning zeros and ones, which means that you're only going to have an image that represents black and white. A grayscale image that is a single band, right? And you can see that it goes from 0 to 255. That is a total of 256 values, 0 being the 256th value. And so each level of gray is going to be attributed a number between 0 and 255 to make up the total number of classes. And when you have a multi-band raster, you can attribute specific RGB, red, green, blue, composite methods for the bands where each pixel again is going to be attributed a specific number, where again within these bands of red and green and blue, and while the RGB color model is capable of storing millions of different colors, which is great for making, fine rendered images, it requires a lot of data storage, which can be difficult to display on a map. So there is an alternate, and that is storing unique colors for, or restricting the amount of color that can appear in an image. To save on storage space, we use an index color raster, which again will attribute a specific color for each band. So each value is associated with a specific RGB color combination. We call this the color map. And this allows us still to have different colors being represented on a map, right? This is an image, this is not vector data, so these are all cells. And so we can quickly identify which cells have what color attributed to them. And now that you have a little bit better understanding of how raster images work, including the color bands and why we can have raster images being grayscale or arguably every color that exists out there, it's also really important to know that we need to classify numeric data as well. So when it comes to classifying data, both raster and vector data often requires that we classify the range of data values into smaller numbers or groups, which again can be represented by different colors or symbol sizes, but this makes it often easier for us to map our data, and this process is called classification. And as you can imagine, there are many ways to classify data, and different types of data classifications have their pros and cons, so it's definitely important for you to take a look and read through the material that's provided in your book, looking at the Jenks method, the equal interval, defined interval, the quantile method, all of these different options to classify data. So figuring out how to choose the correct classification method is another skill in itself. And ultimately, the choice of classification method depends on the purpose of the map or the type of data that you are attempting to display. Through practice and a better understanding of data display, you'll get a better grasp as to what type of classification method is going to serve your purposes best. Jumping ahead to layers, and this is a really important component of working with ArcGIS Pro or any sort of geographic information systems that you will be working with in the future, but it is really important to know that a layer is not the same thing as your source data. Your source data is going to be the data that is often stored in a geodatabase, which is what we'll be working with in class. But the layers that you're pulling from the geodatabase into your map contents pane, which actually displays that data on the map, is not inherently linked, meaning that the changes that you make in a layer will not automatically be changed or represented in the source data. So while your map contents pane is filled with different layers, it's important to know that these are not original data. They are, in essence, a copy that has been added to the map, which is, quote unquote, looking at the source data to gather its information. So if a link gets broken and you have a layer that has a red exclamation mark, it means that the link to its source data has been broken, and that is why it is not displaying on your map. So when a layer's properties are changed, that includes labels or how you're displaying it with different colors, that will not change the source data. But a layer will store the display and label properties that you have attributed to it. So ultimately, it allows multiple users to use the same source data, and then each person, again, represented here by Mike's map, Taylor's map, and Judy's map, can be ultimately displayed differently by changing the attributes within the layer rather than impacting the source data. So when we are working through our labs and we are changing the displays or the symbology, you can save that, and that will save to the layer that is stored in your map, which will ultimately be saved as a layer file. But again, the layer file, which is displayed on your map, is not the source data. So if you delete that layer file, you will be able to pull up the source data by connecting to it, but it may not have saved, or it will not represent all of the visual changes that you have made to the specific layer file. Again, a style is a set of symbols that can be stored together. We have not done that, and you will not be doing that in this week's lab either. But again, they can be used to have or display a specific theme or purpose. And styles can be viewed and selected again from the symbology pane, which is something that we will be looking at for our lab this week. So that's the quick rundown of the additional lecture content that I know we will not get to in class. I hope for the most part this made sense. Definitely go back, read through your book, make sure that you have a decent understanding of the topics that we not only covered in class, but the topics that were covered here in this PowerPoint. And let me know if you have any questions. I'm always happy to help. All right, thanks.